Hello, all of my classical culture friends. Today we're going to do Plato. This will be the second lecture on Plato. Um, Normally it takes me 3 lectures to get through all this material, and it still might. We'll see how it goes tonight. Uh, um, but I'm going to try to be as crisp as I possibly can because I know everybody's life is all kinds of screwy. Before I get into Plato, I want to give a very special shout out um, to the guy who taught me how to even get these things up online. His name is Andrew. He's my nephew. Uh, Here's his picture. Been waiting for this moment. That's Andrew, my nephew. We look a lot alike. Um, he's a senior at George Washington, and he really needs a girlfriend. So, I don't really mean that, but it's an uncle's job to embarrass their nephew, right? So, yeah. So there's that. Okay, so let's get. um, he's gonna kill me. I can't wait. Okay, so anyway, it's just the sun has just come out. It stopped raining today, so everything is nicer. We're going to be talking about Plato's Republic, Book 4 today, which means we're going to be talking about justice, which was the topic that came up in the first book. That was the prior lecture with Cephalos and Polemachos and Thrasymachos and Socrates and the different arguments with respect to justice. But now it's just Glaukos and Socrates who are talking. So it's more direct, shall we say? There's none of Thrasymachos's sophistry floating around. Um, Rather, it's just a strict conversation about this topic of justice itself. So they're they're thinking about justice, and what they mean when they talk about justice is what is the best way to rule a city. That's what they mean when they talk about justice. It doesn't. It's not about we think of justice and we think of like the court system and all that stuff. No, they're basically like, what is the best way that our city can be governed for, and this is implied in the argument, though I don't think it's ever really stated outright. Might be, could be, I don't know. But the idea that like how do most people benefit, from the way that we rule our city, and that's what they're talking about when they talk about justice. So what they decide is that um, it's easier to find things in small batches than it is to find them in large batches, right? So it's like, okay, well, if I told you to go out and find me a green object, you could, under better circumstances, you could just run up and grab a green thumbtack, and that would be fine, right? But now, like if I say go find me a green object, you're not going to bring the whole park back to me. That doesn't make any like that's impossible. So the logical argument here is that things are easier to find in small quantities than in large quantities. Which reminds me, by the way, I'm going to remind you of this. I know I talked about this a lot in the last lecture, but it's a basic philosophical principle. A thing cannot be that thing and its opposite at the same time. Plato's entire argument relies on this. And the basic understanding of this philosophical principle. So I'm sure I'll come back to this at some point. And in fact, I know I will come back to this at some point. So what they do is they since they decide that these qualities will be easier to find in the individual human being rather than in the state as a whole. In other words, qualities are easier to identify in small things rather than they are in large things. That's the argument here. So what they do is um, they break everything down to four qualities, right? Wisdom, courage, um, temperance, moderation. If you watch the Sophocles lecture, you would have heard me discuss this term already. So I'm going to use the Greek term because you should know it. There might be a day that comes when you are examined on it. Might be. Sophrosune. Okay. So basically, what they do is they identify these four qualities as being like sort of essential qualities. So how does and then again, this goes back to something else I talked about in the last lecture, which is that Plato is really keen for us to see that Socrates was not out of step with traditional Athenian values. And so these four values, they're derived from Homer, um, and other poets, but traditional poetry, the kind of stuff that you would have to learn so that you could grow up to be a decent human being. So how do they define wisdom? They define wisdom as that the better part of this, because remember, we're talking about the city state here, right? We're talking about government. So even though we're going back and forth between the soul and the state is made up of souls. So if if you have a clear plastic bag and you fill it up with red T-shirts, and then you look at it from 20 yards away, you're going to think the bag is red, right? Because it's all the individual parts of it that define your perception. So since a city state is made up of individuals, if we can identify the character of individuals, then we can identify the character of a city state as a whole. So, what is wisdom? Oh, I'm totally not gonna. I need my whole chalkboard. Damn it. I'll do my best here. Um, this is one of those classes where the whole board would be covered with writing, which is like not a thing right now. So, but when he defines wisdom as being the idea that the better part controls the worst part. Okay, I'll leave it up. Sorry, took it down too quickly. So wisdom is that the better part controls the worse part. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a minute. That's the definition. Um, I'm going to run through these one by one, and then I'll come back and explain each one of them. Look at this. So, courage is defined as what is or isn't dangerous, or not. Actually, more to the point, knowledge of what is or isn't dangerous. So you can see that in both of these first two ideas in Plato, knowledge is central, which means that both wisdom and courage are technes, or techni, I should say more properly, but in English, technes. Um, so they're rooted in forms of knowledge. They're rooted in knowing not just how to do something, but why you do it, and what the end result of it is. Now, Sophrosune, we don't have to go into too much detail on. This is moderation. self-control. Again, this should be a thing that you have in your notes. Looking at you. Don't think I'm not watching, even though I know you're not watching me. Anyway, so wisdom is that the better part controls the worse. Courage is that courage resides in knowledge of what is or isn't dangerous. And then Sophrosune, which is translated in many ways in many different translations: temperance, moderation, self-control, yada yada. It's basically what it means is that you know your limits, um, in every respect, like physically, mentally, all of that. Like you know where your place is, right? And then we come down to justice. Now I'm going to leave justice off the definition board just for a moment here, and talk about these other principles. So when we talk about wisdom, and we say that what wisdom, or and by we I mean Plato, when we say that wisdom, when Plato, when Plato says that wisdom is that the better part controls the worse, like, okay, so that's like, well, it seems like sort of vaguely non-specific, right? You can't use comparatives like better or worse, or stronger or weaker. Like these have to be qualified by what you're comparing them on, right? So, like, I mean, I'm better at some things than my brother, and I'm worse than other things at him. But you have to be able to identify. Not my nephew, by the way. My nephew. He needs a date. Um, um, sorry. I know I'm a jerk. I can't help it. But so you can't, when you use comparatives like better or worse or stronger or weaker. So you think back to book one of the Republic, where you have Thrasymachos introducing the argument that all justice is the stronger part controlling the weaker part. So how is that different than Socrates' argument that wisdom means that the better part controls the worst part? So you have to, like, I mean, if I tell you, well, we've already actually talked about this in class, so I won't waste any time on it. But anytime you use comparatives, you have to clarify what you're comparing. Like, you can't just say better or worse without saying, better or worse with respect to what? Like, what is it better or worse at? I'm like, so, like, I'm better than my brother, but I'm also worse than my brother. I'm better at my brother. I'm better than my brother at languages, but I'm worse than my brother at science. Like, so you have to put it into context. If you can't tell, I really miss my family. This was a weekend. I know, Passover and Easter. Everybody had holidays this weekend, and I would normally have been at home. When I say at home, I mean back in Pittsburgh, where I grew up. Um, I'm at home, obviously. I'm at home, which has now become very weird. Okay, so let's get back to Plato. All right, so the better part controls the worse. When we talk about better part controls the worse, what are we talking about? We're not talking about like Thrasymachos' argument, where the people with more power simply control the people with less power. That's what he means when he says the stronger controls the weak. When Socrates talks about the better part controls the worse, he's talking about people who have more wisdom making laws for people who don't. So they too have a techne. their skill, the thing that they make. Remember when I talked about techne in the last lecture, I talked about it being a skill or an ability that makes something, that produces something. So in this instance, the techne of the people who possess wisdom is that they make laws for people. It's totally illegible, but okay, the words are clear. They make laws for people, right? Because they're wiser. So what we please excuse me for a moment. So wisdom, this would be easy for me normally, is possessed by a certain group of people, a very small group of people. Let's not forget that Plato, this is political theory. Okay, this is not something he's advocating for in a real sense. Maybe he was. I don't know. But now we read it just as political theory, right? So the city state ends up getting divided into classes of people. So only a few people, the guardians, possess wisdom. The more I read Plato, the more disappointed I get in him. He's kind of a fascist, but you can make your own mind up about that. So the guardians possess wisdom; they make laws. But the point of the fact that of them making laws is that in Plato's utopic ideal of a how a city state should run is that they already know that the laws that they make are not for their benefit, but they're for the benefit of everybody else. Just like if you watch the book one conversation on Plato, which I hope some of you did. I'm watching my views on YouTube. Not pleased. But like if you look at the arguments in book one, remember we talk. Keep saying we. Damn. God, I miss you guys so much. In book one, what Plato talks about is that when the shepherd raises the sheep, it's not the primary benefit goes to the sheep. Like they're going to be better sheep with respect to the qualities that are valued in sheep. They're going to be woolly. They're going to be chubby. They're going to be healthy. When the doctor practices his art, the primary benefit goes to the patient, not to the doctor. Talked all about that already, so won't rehash it. So because wisdom in book 4 is also a techne, that means that the exercise of wisdom doesn't benefit the guardians themselves. It's supposed to benefit the polis, the city-state as a whole. I hope that's clear. If not, you can spark notes it. So then we get the second virtue of the city-state, which is courage, which I've already talked about. Courage is knowledge of what is or isn't dangerous to the polis as a whole. So this class of people, now you can already begin to see a theme in Plato, which is that he likes to class divide. No surprise. He's upper class himself. So these people are called the auxiliaries. This word just simply, I know it looks like a complicated word. In Greek, it just means helper, assistant. And their job is basically to be the police and the military. So they have to know what is and isn't dangerous to the city-state. So they have a domestic and a foreign they have a domestic and a foreign application. That's why I say they're the police and the military. When you jaywalk, you don't get arrested because the police have more important things to do. They have to know what is or isn't, of immediate pressing service. I mean, they might have got a call about whatever your mind fills in, and they have to go. And so yeah, and same thing with the military. You have to know where there is and there isn't a threat, but at the same time, you also have to understand that what you're doing is I don't know how else to put this, is putting your life on the line for the greater um, well-being of the polis of the city-state itself. Um, so they have to be very well trained, and Plato gets into the educational process of the auxiliaries. Um, I won't dwell too long on this, but he uses the metaphor of the way that wool, like, is made, like, not just made, but like, so you might have a red sweater, you might have a yellow sweater, you might have a pink sweater or a purple sweater or a blue sweater, but the fact of the matter is, all that stuff has to be dyed first. So first, all that fabric has to be made, and then it all has to go through this dyeing process. And so that's what Plato says about courage, the virtue of courage, is that when you make wool, first you have to shear the sheep. Sheep, they're not happy about being sheared, um, and so that's a physical, uh, you know, process. And then once you get all the wool off of it, like sheep, I don't know how many of you grew up on farms or near farms or have experience with farms, but sheep are filthy. They're nasty. They're mean. Like we think, because we have all these cartoon kind of like characterizations of sheep, and we think of them as just being friendly and gentle, but that's not at all the case in real life. Like when you deal with them in the wild or on the farm. I shouldn't put on the farm in quotes, but yeah, in the wild. Well, especially in the wild. God forbid you come across a ram. But anyway, uh, sheep are like, they're filthy, they're dirty. So even if you can get them through the chute, and that's what they use to shear sheep, you run them through a chute that's only as wide as they are, and then as they run down the chute, you just buzz them with a clipper. Um, but never mind. You can Google it and look it up if you want to. But so the sheep are not happy about being sheared. So like, what? No, I'm sorry. I totally went down. I went down the farm hole. Sorry. Um, uh, like so when Socrates starts talking about sheep and making wool for like making garments, like this is not where you just go to Uniqlo or Target or the Gap store and you pull a pack of T-shirts off the rack, or you find as I am fond of doing, a sweater off the sale rack or whatever. Like this is totally different. This is a something that Plato's audience would have understood as being a more physically involved process. And so, like shearing the sheep, you get the wool off their back, but when you get the wool off their back, it's filthy. Then you have to scrub it all, you have to wash it all, then you have to straighten it all. So what you do is you put all of the sheep hair, aka the wool, into a big bin, and then you take a big thing. It's called um, it's called a comb, basically, and you have to run through it constantly. Now remember, this is like 20 feet long. Like this isn't just like combing your hair. You have to be able to drive this thing all the way along the trough that's filled with hair. So, and then once it's all straightened, you have to bleach it, which took days. I mean, I know we all have bleach in our house these days, or those of us who got to the grocery stores before the days of hoarding have bleach. Not me. I don't have any bleach. Um, but like so that would have taken several days. It has to dry, and then only then can you make it different colors. And then even then, when you make it different colors, remember there's no like you can't go onto eBay and just buy like synthetic dye here. You have to like the all the dyes are natural dyes. I mean they're ground up plants. If you want green dye, you have to ground up so many tree leaves. If you want yellow dye, you have to ground up so many plant petals, and on and on. If you want purple dye, then you have to be rich. That's why purple was the color of the kings. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Um, so this whole notion of the education of the auxiliaries is meant to establish, how important it is for the people in this class to know what is dangerous to the city-state versus what is not dangerous to the city-state. So again, it's a technique. It's a field of knowledge. Okay, let me move on. Sorry, I went too long about dyeing, the process of shearing sheep and dyeing. So let's talk about Sophrosune here for a minute. Sophrosune, a mode of self-control, moderation, staying in your place. Oh yeah, staying in your place. This is a very class-divided system that Plato is setting up here. Now he like it's ideal because he assumes that the people who rule are going to have everybody's best interest at heart. We know from human experience that that is not the case. So I'm not. Please don't think that I am advocating Plato's ideas here. I am not advocating them at all. I don't care whether you agree with Plato or not. I only care that you know what Plato says. Okay? Good. So the people who possess Sophrosune, I mean, there's different translations of this. One of the more common ones, certainly the one that's used in the translation that I gave you for class, is money makers. We already know from our first conversation that Plato really looks down on the idea of making money, which is very convenient for a dude who grew up rich. But besides that, um, uh, so the class of the city that possess Sophrosune, which is to say the class of people who know their own place, right? They accept the laws given by the guardians. They accept the fact that the auxiliaries know how and when to enforce the law. Um, Everybody else just does their job. So I call them the technicians, which is a nicer, at least gives the rest of us dignity. Of course, everybody is a technician in the sense that they have a techne in the city, but these are the people who make stuff. These are people who make your shoes. These are people who cook your food. They're not the people who make your laws. They're not the people who enforce your laws. But they are the people that you interact with every day on a day-to-day basis. So they're the much larger sort of population quantity of the polis of the city-state. Okay, so basically, what in the Republic, what the way that Plato, I go back and forth. Please, I go back and forth between saying Plato says and Socrates says. Please remember what I said in the last lecture. Socrates is a literary character, so he says most of the stuff, right? It's really Plato's ideas. So if I go back and forth, don't be confused by that. Okay, so in Plato / Socrates schema here, the ideal city-state, the ideal polis will have three classes to it. The guardians, that's a G. I know it looks like a Q. I'm sorry. Now I look at it. Now I can see. So the guardians make the laws because they're wiser than everybody else. So the better part controls the worse, which is to say the wise people make laws for the less wise people, right? Then you have the auxiliaries, who are the police and the military, and what they know, their techne is that they know what is dangerous or what is not dangerous. And when we talk about what is dangerous or what is not dangerous, what we mean is what is dangerous or not dangerous to the laws of the state, right? They're not. I've been a little hard on Plato and his fascism up to this point, but I'll be easier on him here. When he talks about the auxiliaries and that their techne is that they know what is dangerous or what is not dangerous, he's not suggesting that they should be like a personal army for the guardians. He's not suggesting that they should be bodyguards to the lawmakers. What he's saying is that they understand, they've been educated in the constitution of the polis, and then therefore they can identify situations where, okay, well, here's this thing that's like sort of slightly wrong, but no big deal. And then here's this other thing that is like really a big deal, right? That's what they have to be educated in. So that's the techne of courage. And then you get the technicians, like I said already, us people. I should be more accurate on this. This is the general labor force, who make things that are subsequently consumed by everybody else in the polis. Okay, so you get wisdom, you get courage, you get sophrosune, right? And you add all those things up, and then when all those things are present, only then can you start thinking about justice. All these other things, these other three qualities have to be in place before you can start talking about justice. Okay, so talked about the state. Let's talk about how they break down the individual human soul at this stage. I'm going to write the same words right here. Wisdom, courage, and sophrosune. I know that, I could use the Greek words for wisdom and courage, but the English words do well enough in that instance. There is no English equivalent for sophrosune. There just isn't one. The word sophrosune it was metaphysical, basically, in its what's the word I'm looking for here? In its semantic implications. You had to know. It meant knowing who you were in your community. It meant knowing who you were in your city. It meant knowing who you were as a human being. It was just a really broad. Broad is the wrong word to use here. Metaphysical was the better word. It was a very metaphysical sort of concept. So I'm going to use the Greek word. If you don't like it, I don't know, do something about it. So when we look at, the argument here is that if we find these qualities in an individual, then they'll also be reflected in the state itself, right? So with wisdom, so let me go back here for a second. So in the city-state, wisdom is possessed by the guardians, which is to say, I mean, Plato doesn't use these exact words, but basically what he means is the people who are smarter than everybody. That's more or less what he means. So wisdom is possessed by the guardians, wisdom being that the wiser make rules for the less wise. Okay, so when he looks at the individual, he identifies that with the faculty of reason. So in every person's individual soul, what Plato's argument says is that just as in the city state, wisdom can be found in the class of the guardians, so in each and every individual, we all have this faculty in our soul. He calls them souls. Okay, so let me. God damn it! Never gonna finish this lecture. The Greek word for soul is psyche, psyche. Like as in your like English word psychology. It's one word. Sorry, I know I wrote it awkwardly. But so psyche, right? And so we think of psychology as being something that just happens in our brains, but for the ancient Greeks, it was something that happened all over our bodies. Like it wasn't just located into our minds, into our brains. There were other physical. I mean, I'm not. I won't go into it now. So I have to go all the way back to Homer and explain Homer's understanding of physiology and psychology in the world of Homer, and we're past that. So I'm not. Right. Okay. So just as in the city state, the guardians are the wiser ones who make laws that are, at least in theory, beneficial for the less wise people, which is us down here, the technicians. So in our psyche, in our soul, reason, our faculty of reason tells us how to act and how not to act. So what does that mean? Well, there's different kinds of reason that happen. I'll write them down. I don't know how legible they'll be. So, I mean, I put 4 on the list here. I'm sure that this list could be expanded, but I think this gives a pretty good overview. Like when we think about taking a particular course of action, there are some fundamental courses of logic that we run through to decide whether taking that course of action will be good or will be bad. In other words, whether it'll benefit ourselves and others or whether it will harm ourselves and others. Okay, so one of those modes is moral reasoning, right? And so what moral reasoning is that when you think about whether a thing that you're going to do is really absolutely, like, even if nobody ever finds out about it, whether it's still right or wrong, right? You walk by, let me think of an example. You walk by, so let's say you're in the locker room, you just worked out, and somebody left their purse in an open locker, or their wallet in an open locker, right? And you know that person is in the shower and has no idea and would never know. That's moral reasoning. Do you take the wallet or do you leave the wallet? I'd recommend you leave the wallet personally. But that's what I mean by moral reasoning. Nobody will ever find out. Only you will ever know. So moral reasoning is how you judge yourself, how you judge your own behavior based on what you know to be right or wrong. Okay. Then, I wouldn't say opposed to it, but like in some senses in contrast to it is ethical reason. Now, so moral reasoning is how does this decision that I'm about to make, what, how does that measure up to the standards that I know are right or wrong? Now, I know we all grow up in different ways and all that stuff, but like, whatever. So the moral reasoning is like how does this measure up to what I know is like these sort of absolute truths of rightness or wrongness, right? So it's never okay to murder somebody, right? But the ethical aspect of things, this comes from the Greek word ethos. Ethos is your community, where you grow up. So ethical reasoning is different from moral reasoning, right? Moral reasoning is how does this decision or how does this action measure up to something that I think of as being absolutely right or wrong. Ethical reasoning has to do with how does this decision I'm about to make affect the people who live around me? How does this affect my neighborhood? How does this affect my community, my city? How does this affect the subway train I'm about to get on, right? So, like, you're waiting for a subway train that pulls up and the doors open and you step onto it, right? Okay, so not morally incorrect, but ethically incorrect. You should let the people off the train before you step on the train. So there's nothing immoral about that, but there is something unethical about that. So they're two different modes of valuation, I should say. Then, of course, we make our decisions based on what is legal or illegal. Um, should I take the purse out of the empty open locker? Should I take the wallet out of the dude's jeans when I know he's not looking? Um, what would happen if they like? So I don't care about your moral judgments. I don't care about your ethical judgments. But what's the legal consequence? What if that woman or that man comes out of the shower just as you're pilfering it, and you have legal consequences to deal with, right? So that's another. So okay, I'll write this down real quick. Let me get a piece of paper that I have not yet totally used. So what we're talking about here, and what Plato is talking about here, are processes of what we call, or at least what I call, uh, consequential logic. What's going to happen if I do this thing that I'm thinking about doing, right? So, like, is this a thing that I know is wrong in an absolute sense, and therefore open myself up to karma, judgment, whatever? Um, is this a thing that I know if I do it will negatively affect the people around me, right? Or is this a thing that will land me in jail or get me a fine or whatever? And of course, medical reasoning is a part of this too. I don't think I need to spend too much time on that. Is doing this thing going to make me sick or not? Oddly enough, all of these things kind of overlap in these days. Um, Sorry, I'm going to say this real quick. Um, Wear a mask and wear gloves. If you don't have a mask, all you need is a t-shirt. It's not that hard at the end of the day. And remember, when you wear gloves, you're protecting yourself. from touching stuff that's been infected. But when you wear a mask, you're protecting your neighbors. You're protecting the people that you live with. Um, so if and when you go out of doors, I'm assuming that, uh, well, I'm not assuming anything. Sorry, wrong way to start that sentence. But like, I hope that you're all okay. I haven't heard from everybody. I wish that I heard from more of you, with respect to just saying, I'm fine, I'm okay, because I worry and I miss you. And yeah, so yeah, all right. Anyway, back to Plato and his fascism. He is kind of a fascist. I mean, like, he wants, like, there's no doubt that the system is set up by class divides. Like, there's definitely, and he does it, like, it's not, we're not going to get into, like, I'm not going to get into this too much because it comes a bit later in the Republic, but he actually literally talks about people who are, he calls them gold, silver, and bronze. So he actually believes in this kind of like genetic predetermination idea that only people who are born gold can be guardians, and people who are born silver should be auxiliaries, and people who are born bronze are the auxiliaries. Anyway, okay, that's all well and good, or not. Um, it's quite depressing at this particular moment in history, but hey, you gotta play with the cards you're dealt, right? So when we get to courage and we talk about what that means in the soul, and when we get to Sophrosune, so so coincidentally or conveniently, the soul is broken into three parts, uh, just as the ideal state is broken into three parts. And don't worry, I'm coming back to justice. Don't think that you're off the hook there just yet. Where am I at in time? Okay, I got a lot of time. All right. So when we talk about Sophrosune, it's the same thing. It's this idea of self-control, um, just in the soul as it is in the state. And when we talk about courage in the soul, it gets a little trickier with his definition of courage. And I'm going to give you a Greek word right now. Too bad. This word is, let's see if I put it up here close enough for you to read it, thymos or thumos, depending on what dialect you speak. I'll write it over here again, just so it's perfectly clear. So, wisdom is housed in the reasoning part of the soul. That's purely logical. Purely logical. Doesn't have anything to do with what you want or what you don't want. Then you have your Sophrosune, which is supposed to be governed by self-control. But the reason why it has to be governed by self-control is because this is where your desires live. And your desires don't give a shit about whether what you're going to do is a sin against God or hurt your next door neighbor or land you in jail or put you in the hospital. You just want to do that thing, right? So this is rational, and the Sophrosune aspect, the desiring part of the soul, is totally non-rational. So that tells us, when we think back to Plato's argument going back into Book 1, right? So there has to be definitely two parts of the soul, because remember, a thing can't be one thing and the opposite of that thing at the same time. So if reason is by definition non-emotional, emotion or desire is by definition non-reasoning. Gotta be two different parts. It has to be, because you can't. So look, okay. Well, I usually this is easier to illustrate when I have a bigger platform, but like, so okay. So here's my hand, right? So my left hand, right? So I can push on my left hand with my right hand, right? Or I can pull on my left hand with my right hand, but I can't do both of them at the same time. Like you can't push and pull. I mean, like we call it, squeezing or hugging or whatever. But like you can't. You literally, I can't push this and pull it at the same time with one hand. I could probably do it. I could push and pull it with if I have my foot, but then that's three different parts. So, so in Plato's logic, his very strict logic here, therefore, what we want, but also then what we think like rationally about, they necessarily have to be two different parts of the soul. Those of you who have done any psychology already can, I'm sure, already spot the roots of Freudianism here, because there's a third part, which is this part, which is called the thymos, right? And this is where the courage sits. Now, thymos can, as far as I'm concerned, it's never actually received a decent translation. Again, this is one of those Greek words that we don't have an English word for. In the translation that I put on the syllabus, I think he calls this the spirited temper, which, like, what does that mean? No one knows. But what the thymos is, so we got id, we've already done id, and super ego. What the thymos is, I'm sorry, I'm going to use the same page. I'm drawing arrows for definitions, but just because I'm trying to save trees. This is, it's self-directed, self-correcting anger. So this is what Freud will, in his later psychology, turn into guilt. Though, again, like, doesn't, Plato's not Freud, so they're talking about different things. So self-directed, self-correcting anger. Sorry, let me make sure I get this whole thing on screen. So we got three parts of the soul over here, right? Reason, thymos, and self-control, sophrosune, or desire, the desiring part of the soul, right? And they all correspond. I'm going to try to hold this up. I don't know if this will work or not. But you can see how when you look at, I know how I can make this work. 2 seconds. You can see when you look at his two arguments about the ideal state, setup of the ideal state, but then you also look at his arguments about the soul, how the things directly correspond. The guardians are the reason of the city. They're the ones who know what is better or worse. That is to say, they can make valuable moral, ethical, of course, they make the laws, so legal judgments, right? And then the auxiliaries, the military. So the thymos is like, in Plato's formulation, the thymos is like the police of your soul. What it does is tells you that what you're doing is wrong, or that what you have just done is wrong. It self-corrects you, okay? And then you got the self-control aspect of the state, which in Plato's formulation is the working classes. Sorry, hard for me not to be sarcastic here. But in your soul, and again, remember now when we talk about the soul, it's not just like, we're not talking about this Judeo-Christian concept. So when we use this word soul In English nowadays, it's like this vapor that lives in somewhere inside your body, somewhere here ish, never below the waist, of course. Um, but like, so the soul goes on after you die, and it's your true character. That's what we, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that's what when we talk about soul, that's what we mean. It's like your true essence, and it has all your best characteristics, but none of your worst characteristics. Um, um, but in the Greek concept, the soul contains a lot more in terms of what we separate out by our. I mean, there's modern science and all that stuff, and so we separate it out by physiology, and like we know that like um, I don't need to give you any examples of this, but like we know that we have physiological processes that affect our mental processes, but we can also sort of separate those two things out. Like I might be standing in a line and true story. I might be standing in line outside the bodega waiting for, the next person to leave, and someone could walk in right in front of me, and I could get pissed. But that's a kind of hormonal reaction. Logically, I think to myself, um, is this worth the consequences? I mean, is it really worth it with 4 other people in line? Is it really worth it for me to, confront this other person? So the initial kind of like hormonal reaction is go, go commit some act of physical violence. But the logical reaction, the consequential reaction, is to say, well, okay, this isn't really necessarily in this situation. Maybe say something, which I did, by the way. Um, um, uh, Maybe say something, but let's not. It's just simply not the time or the place to have this particular confrontation. So there's 2 different processes there, right? There's the gut reaction, and then there's the mental process. So it's easy to see those 2 things. I think when you read Plato, it's very easy to see those 2 processes as being different. I mean, it's intuitive, right? We know that what we want to do is not always necessarily the best thing that we should do, and so we can separate those 2 things out. The tricky one is this one, the middle one, the spirited temper, aka the thymos, the courage of the soul, because at one and the same. So look, here's the thing. I'm gonna try to keep this as short and punchy as possible. I will tell you that this is often, in my experience in teaching Plato and the Republic, that this is sometimes conceptually one of the tougher things to deal with. But just hear me out for a second, okay? So let's first of all remind ourselves of this principle that a thing cannot be its opposite at the same time. Now, I mean, you can dispute that as a philosophical principle, but the fact of the matter is that that's a basic step of logic that you have to accept if you're going to understand Plato's other arguments. We can argue whether or not that's true at some other point, which I would love to do. But Plato is I gave you this term before. This is an a priori assumption. He just assumes that it's true, that your coffee can't be hot and cold at the same time, that a rock can't be hard and soft at the same time, and just still be one thing. Like it's made up of parts, then sure, it's possible, but then it's not one thing. It's made up of parts. Okay, so this brings us back to the three parts of the soul. Now, we've already discussed reason and desire as two parts of the soul, and again, that's like barely even needs arguing. Like I think we all know that from basic human experience. But it's this thymos, the self-directed, self-correcting anger that needs a little bit of clarification. Okay, so first of all, you look at that definition, you see the word anger. So you're like, well, that's emotion. So why doesn't that just belong to the desiring part of the soul? Because the desiring part of the soul includes emotion. Why? Because emotion is non-rational. When I wake up in the morning, I don't have to tell myself, well, I've been asleep for 8 hours and I haven't eaten, so I should probably have some breakfast now. You don't have to tell yourself that. You wake up and you're hungry. Like it's not a thing that you have to think about or that you have to process, right? So why is this particular kind of anger outside of, why does this make up a third part of the soul? Why should we think of this guilty feeling when you know you did something wrong? Why does that definitely constitute third part of the soul? Okay, so I'm going to come back here. I know you're probably sick of me holding this up, but remember this basic principle. A thing can't be one thing and be its opposite at the same time and still be thought of one thing. So when we look at the parts of the soul, we see that, well, I mean, the easy one is that, obviously thymos, which is anger, can't be a part of reason because reason is by definition non-rational. Can't be rational and not rational at the same time. Can't push and pull at the same time. So it is by definition non-rational. But you're like, oh, it says the word anger, so why can't it be part of desire or emotion? Because it's correcting, that's the self-correction part of it. It's correcting what you do because you fall into your desires over what your reason tells you. So if it's acting in the opposite force of your desires or your emotions, it can't do this. It can't be one and the same thing. It can't both be enforcing and not enforcing your desires at the same time unless it's a different part of your soul. So that's Plato's argument on the three parts of the soul. I'll end real quickly here, especially because YouTube tends to cut videos off after 1:15. So it's like, and this is an example I've used in classes past, and I think it's a pretty neat example. But if there's let's say that like summer hits in New York and there's a massive drought and the mayor says we have to water ration, right? So every household based on your tax returns, right? So if there's 3 members of your household, you get 3 liters of water. For the one, you get 1. If there's 2, you get 2, et cetera, right? So you get 1 liter of water per member of your household every day. And so it's like summertime and like sort of late summer, August-y, early September, and your mom comes to you and she says, listen, I know we're under this drought and things are bad, but, there's house repairs that have to be done. You have to go fix the the caulking on the windows on the third floor, or you have to go clean out the gutters, or you have to go rake the leaves, or whatever. So you go out and you're out all day, and it's like 95 degrees, and you're sweating, and you plow your not plow, but you kind of you drink your whole liter of water over the course of the day because you're working and you're sweating and you got to stay hydrated, right? Then you come back inside, and when you come back in the house, you walk in, you walk, through the living room, and there's your brother lying on the couch, half asleep, and with a baseball game on, which is, if it's the Mets, would explain why he's asleep. But anyway, and his water is his water is like right there on the little table next to him, and you can see that he's opened it, but he's only drunk about that much of it, right? So what do you think? Like, what are you gonna do? What is your desire? What does the desiring part of your soul tell you to do? Your desiring part of your soul says, "Hey, I'm freaking thirsty, and I worked all day, and this lazy MFer has been on the couch all day and hasn't done anything," right? What does the reason part of your soul tell you? Well, whatever you think about the moral and ethical aspects of this, I don't know what your relationship with your siblings is, so it could differ, but it is certainly illegal to drink the water, because there's a citywide decree. Everybody gets 1 liter of water. So to drink your brother's water without his knowledge is illegal. It's theft. It's the same thing as taking the purse out of the locker or the wallet out of the jeans, to use the early examples, right? So you're kind of standing there and you're dying of thirst, and you can't even take a shower because there's water rationing. You're miserable. You've done all the work. Here's your lazy brother on the couch. So what do? You pick up the bottle and you drink. Start drinking from it. And as soon as those first drops hit the back of your throat, your mom walks in. And she says, "What are you doing? Your brother has a fever of 103 degrees. He needs to stay hydrated, or we have to take him to the hospital." Whoops. So how do you feel at that particular time? You feel this. You feel this self-directed, self-correcting anger. You're mad at yourself. You know you did something wrong, right? It doesn't come from your reason, because it's an immediate emotion. So the thymos doesn't come from reason, because reason is by definition purely logical, and the thymos is a pure emotion. So it can't be the same thing, right? At the same time, it's obviously not coming from your desires, because you're clearly fulfilling your desires as you're drinking the water. So it can't be desire either. It can't come from here, and at the same time be from here. So Plato's argument is, in fact, that there are 3 parts of the soul. We will come to know these in Freudianism under the names of id, ego, and superego. He rips off Plato, basically. So let me see. I think that's about all I have to say. I know that this is one of the more, shall I say, involved lectures in terms of just argumentation. If you need me to clarify things, please send me an email. I will not respond to your email, but what I will do is, if I get enough responses of people who are confused, I will post another short video addressing concerns that are raised. Okay? Love you. Miss you.